Catherine always played the role of the strong one, the peacekeeper, the fixer, the daughter who never asked for anything. Her younger sister Brooke was the fragile one, the emotional one, the center of their mother Diane's world. At every stage of life, Catherine was expected to step aside, let Brooke shine, and carry the weight without complaint. Even as a child, she was told, "You're older, you understand," as if understanding meant she didn't need love too. But on her wedding day, standing beside the only man who had ever truly seen her, Catherine hoped, just this once, she might be allowed her moment. A celebration for her, a day that belonged to no one else. She was wrong. Just before the reception toast, Diane leaned in and whispered, "We're keeping your wedding gift money. Brooke needs it more." That was the moment everything changed. Catherine didn't fold. She didn't forgive. She walked away forever. Catherine grew up learning how to disappear. Not literally, of course, but emotionally, quietly, invisibly. From the moment her sister Brooke was born, the energy in the house shifted. Brooke was the sensitive one, the emotional one, the one who needed extra care. Catherine, just 3 years older, was dubbed the strong one. That label sounded like a compliment, but it was really a license for neglect. If Brooke cried over a toy, Diane would say, "Catherine, let her have it. You're older." If Brooke threw a tantrum at the grocery store, Rick would bend down and whisper, "Just give in, sweetheart. You know how she gets." Catherine did know. And so, she learned to give in before it became a scene. To surrender the toy, the attention, the space because Brooke needed more, and needing less was supposed to be strength. As they grew older, the pattern didn't fade. It matured. When Catherine turned 16, she took on a weekend job and paid for her own clothes and school supplies. Diane said it was admirable. Rick said it built character. But when Brooke turned 16, she was handed car keys and a credit card. "Just focus on your studies," Diane told her, brushing her hair gently, a moment Catherine had never received. When Catherine asked Onskaduk why things were different, Diane only said, "Brooke's not as strong as you. She needs more support." It was the same script, recycled endlessly. College was the same story. Catherine applied for scholarships, worked double shifts, rented a dingy basement room, and lived off boxed pasta. When a surprise medical bill hit her junior year, she called home in desperation. Diane sighed. "I wish we could help, honey, but things are tight right now." Because she had no other choice. But when Brooke was accepted into a private university, every expense was covered. Tuition, apartment, furniture, even groceries. "We just want her to focus," Diane said again. Dan Myers was the first person who truly saw Catherine. He noticed how she flinched when someone raised their voice, how she always volunteered to help but never asked for anything, how she laughed too quickly when dismissed. When he proposed, Catherine was stunned, not because she didn't love him, but because no one had ever chosen her so openly, so certainly. It was a rainy afternoon, and when Dan slipped the ring on her finger, she cried, not just from happiness, but from relief. Planning the wedding should have been joyful, and for a few weeks it was. Catherine allowed herself to imagine a day that was entirely hers, but the cracks started to show early. Diane sighed at every mention of cost. Rick muttered about how tight things were financially. Brooke rolled her eyes, called Catherine dramatic, and made snide jokes about bridesmaid dresses. Catherine made excuses. "They're just stressed," she told Dan, but Dan wasn't buying it. "They're going to pull something," he warned one night. Catherine shook her head. Not at the wedding. They wouldn't. But even as she said it, her voice wavered. And that's when Dan reached into his jacket, pulled out a sealed envelope, and set it on the table. "Just in case," he said simply. Catherine didn't ask what was inside. She didn't need to. Because deep down, part of her had always known. Her family hadn't changed. They never would, and this time, she might need to be ready. As wedding planning picked up, Catherine started to feel the old weight pressing on her shoulders. Diane questioned every decision. Every time Catherine mentioned a caterer or dress fitting, her mother would tilt her head and sigh. "Weddings are so expensive these days," she'd say softly, like it was just an observation. Rick chimed in too, rarely directly, but always pointed. "I've been cutting back lately," he'd murmur over dinner. "What with everything we've given Brooke this year?" There was always a comparison. Always a reminder. Brooke didn't bother pretending. She rolled her eyes when Catherine talked about floral arrangements. She scoffed at the idea of a bridal registry. "It's one day," she said loudly at brunch. "You're acting like you're royalty." When Catherine cried at the cake tasting out of sheer joy, Brooke laughed. "Okay, princess." Dan heard it all. He kept his voice calm, but Catherine could see his concern building. "They're going to pull something," he warned. Catherine shook her head. "Not this time. It's our wedding." But even she didn't fully believe it. Then the day arrived, and for a few precious hours, Catherine allowed herself to hope. The sky was clear. The florist arrived early. Her dress fit perfectly. Dan looked at her like she was the only person in the world. Diane brought her a cup of tea while she was getting ready. She smoothed Catherine's hair, smiled warmly, and handed her a small card. Inside it read, "No matter what today, you are our daughter and you are loved." It was simple, but it cracked something open. Catherine let herself believe, just for a moment, that maybe they had changed. Maybe today would be different. The ceremony was soft and beautiful. The music, the vows, the way Dan looked at her, it felt like everything she had never been allowed to have. During the reception, guests laughed, danced, toasted. Catherine floated on joy she hadn't felt in years. Until Dan touched her arm. Her mother's smile was too bright, too rehearsed. "Come with me for a moment," she said gently, guiding Catherine to a quiet corner near the bar. The music faded behind them. Diane took Catherine's hands and held them like she was about to deliver good news. "You look radiant," she said. "It's such a lovely evening." Then came the pause, too long, too measured. "We're keeping your wedding gift money," she said sweetly. "Brooke needs it more than you do." Catherine froze. "I'm sorry?" Diane smiled again, as if she were being generous. "You have Dan now. You're starting your life together. Brooke, she's struggling. It's only fair she gets a little help." Rick appeared behind them, silent, arms crossed. Brooke lingered nearby, not even pretending to feel ashamed. This wasn't a request. It wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. A declaration. But what Diane didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Dan had seen this coming, and he had come prepared. Dan stepped forward before Catherine could speak. Calm, collected, and resolute, he pulled a sealed envelope from his jacket pocket and handed it to Diane without a word. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it, and her smile faltered as she read the first line. It was a notarized legal document, signed weeks before the wedding, declaring that all monetary gifts received at the ceremony were legally the property of Catherine and Dan. Any attempt to withhold or redirect those funds, by family or otherwise, would be considered theft and prosecuted accordingly. Diane's face went pale. Rick leaned over her shoulder, scanned the document, and scowled. "What the hell is this?" he asked, his voice low and defensive. Dan didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "It's protection, against people who think love gives them ownership." For a moment, there was silence. Then Brooke exploded. "Are you serious? I needed that money. Catherine has everything, she always has, and I have nothing." Her voice cracked, louder than the music in the background. Rick turned sharply toward her. His voice was cold. "I've never been so ashamed of you." But Catherine didn't flinch. She stood straight, watching it all unfold, like she had finally stepped outside the glass box of her childhood. For the first time, she wasn't the one expected to fix it. She met her father's eyes and held his gaze without blinking. The silence that passed between them said more than any argument ever could. Diane scrambled to reframe the moment. "We're your family," she said, her tone shifting from indignation to pleading. "We've done everything for you. You wouldn't even be here without us. You're being ungrateful." Catherine tilted her head slightly. "No," she said evenly. You were Brooke's family. You tolerated me. There's a difference." The shift in power was unmistakable. They had expected the old version of Catherine, the girl who would go along to keep the peace, who would swallow the insult and smile through the pain. But standing before them now was a woman who had drawn her line in the sand and who had no intention of stepping back. Dan didn't need to speak again. He stood beside her, silent and sure, the embodiment of everything Catherine had fought for: respect, love, protection. Together they formed a united front that could not be manipulated or guilted into submission. Catherine turned to walk away, but her mother grabbed her wrist. "You don't mean this," Diane whispered. "You're angry. You'll regret it." Catherine looked down at her mother's hand, then up into her eyes. Her voice was soft, but unshakable. "You never saw me, but I see myself now." She gently pulled her hand free and walked back toward the reception room, where laughter still echoed and the life she'd built, on her own terms, was waiting. Behind her, Diane's voice didn't follow. Neither did Rick. And Brooke's sobs faded into the background as Catherine rejoined her chosen family and the future that was finally, rightfully, hers. As Catherine returned to the reception hall, the music and laughter swirled around her like a distant echo. Her feet moved on instinct, but her chest was tight, her breath shallow. Something had shifted deep inside. Dan's hand found hers, warm and steady. She looked at him, saw the quiet calm in his eyes, and realized he'd always known this day might come. That envelope wasn't paranoia, it was foresight. It was love, a kind of love she'd never received from the people who raised her. Around her, friends toasted and danced, unaware of the storm that had just passed. The photographer snapped a picture of Catherine smiling softly at Dan, but she barely registered the flash. Her mother's voice rang in her head like a bell she couldn't silence. "Brooke needs it more." So casual, so matter-of-fact, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. That phrase hit her harder than any insult or argument ever had. It was a summary of her entire childhood. She smiled politely, made an excuse about needing to touch up her makeup, and slipped out toward the bridal suite. Once inside, she locked the door and stood still. The room was quiet. Her wedding dress whispered as she walked to the mirror. The image staring back was elegant, composed, but her heart was in shards. She sat slowly, hands clasped in her lap, and began to cry. Not just for tonight, but for everything. For every dance recital she attended alone, while Brooke was showered with praise for showing up late. For the school projects she completed in silence, while her parents helped Brooke build a papier-mâché volcano. For the maybe next times, when she asked for help. For the way she'd been told her whole life that being the strong one was enough. Tears spilled freely, staining the satin at her neckline. And then came the anger. Not loud or violent, but steady, like lava beneath the surface. She had protected them from her pain for years, and they'd never even noticed. She had begged for scraps of emotional presence, while they gave Brooke a feast. There was a soft knock at the door. She didn't answer. A moment later, Dan entered with the spare key. He didn't speak at first. He sat down beside her on the love seat, the same one they'd chosen together during the venue walkthrough. His tuxedo jacket was wrinkled, his boutonniere slightly wilted, but his presence was solid. After a long pause, he said quietly, "They don't deserve you, but I do, and I will spend every day proving that." Catherine turned her head, her eyes still wet. "You saw this coming." Dan nodded. "I hoped it wouldn't, but I prepared just in case. Not because I didn't believe in your family, but because I believe in you." She took a breath, deep and full. It felt like the first true inhale in years. The weight hadn't vanished, but it had shifted. She wasn't carrying it alone anymore. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and he rested his cheek gently against her hair. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she had to earn someone's loyalty. She already had it. Catherine sat there in silence, not to hide, but to feel. to grieve, to let go of the version of her who thought she had to keep shrinking so others could breathe. She wiped her eyes, stood up slowly, and looked in the mirror one more time. Her face was tired, but not broken. She wasn't walking back into that reception to pretend anymore. She was walking back as herself. Catherine didn't throw a public fit. She didn't demand an apology or cause a scene. That wasn't her style, and it wouldn't have worked. Her parents had made an art of gaslighting her pain, twisting her disappointment into overreaction. So instead, she crafted a quiet revenge, undeniable, irreversible, and devastating in its clarity. The morning after the wedding, while most newlyweds were sleeping in or boarding planes for their honeymoon, Catherine and Dan met with their attorney. The legal declaration Dan had provided Diane during the reception was only the beginning. They had kept meticulous records. Catherine had screenshots of all registry items and financial gift portals. Dan had made sure every gift and cash transaction was routed into an account they both controlled, with two-factor authentication. Their attorney reviewed the account logs and found something disturbing. 3 days before the wedding, someone had attempted to access the funds using Catherine's maiden name and a duplicate IP address from her parents' house. Diane, that attempt, time-stamped and flagged, was now official evidence. It wasn't just manipulation, it bordered on theft. Catherine said nothing to her parents about it. Instead, she canceled the $10,000, 0 cents cashier's check she had quietly prepared as a post-wedding thank you gift to Diane and Rick. She never told them, never announced it. They wouldn't even know it existed. That money went instead into a new account labeled Future Daughter, a quiet promise to herself that if she ever had a child, to feel forgotten, lesser, or invisible. The next step was digital. Catherine removed every access point. Diane and Rick were blocked from her phone, her email, her social media. Brooke's number was deleted. No confrontations, no explanations, just boundaries. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel guilty about closing a door. She felt clean. Then came the final move. 3 months later, Catherine and Dan closed on their new home, a craftsman-style cottage tucked in a tree-lined neighborhood, nothing flashy but filled with light and peace. To celebrate, they threw a housewarming party. The guest list was made up entirely of people who had shown up for Catherine without condition. Dan's family, Catherine's few close friends, even her old college roommate, who'd driven 6 hours to attend the wedding. Photos from the party were posted to social media, the flower arrangements, the backyard string lights, the warmth, it was all documented. But the caption Catherine wrote beneath one particular photo of her and Dan, laughing in the doorway of their new home, said, "Everything. Some families are chosen. Some must be left behind. Here's to building something better." It went viral within her extended social circle. People shared it, commented, and whispered. Relatives texted, asking what had happened. Her aunt messaged 3 times. A cousin she hadn't spoken to in years sent a voicemail saying, "I wish I'd known. I'm proud of you." The silence from Diane, Rick, and Brooke stretched on. 2 days later, Brooke left a comment under the housewarming post. It was passive-aggressive and pointed. "Must be nice when everything is handed to you." No context, no grace. Dan saw it first. He didn't hesitate. He replied publicly, "It's amazing what happens when you earn your peace." And then Catherine followed with a single line that silenced every critic, every whisper, every guilt trip disguised as concern. "I stopped apologizing for being happy." The likes poured in. Friends who had seen her bend over backward for family approval finally understood. Former coworkers who had only known the quiet, composed Catherine messaged her privately, saying her strength inspired them. One even admitted she'd cut off her own mother for similar reasons. Catherine didn't post again for a week. Not because she was hiding, but because she didn't need to explain herself anymore. She and Dan lit a fire in their backyard that weekend. They cooked, played music, danced barefoot in the grass. It wasn't flashy, but it was hers. Her revenge hadn't come in shouts. It came in serenity, in chosen silence. in a life carefully, lovingly, built away from those who once demanded her silence. And in the echo of Brooke's bitter comment, Catherine heard what she had always known to be true. Peace is the loudest answer. The months that followed were quieter than Catherine expected. Diane didn't reach out again. Not a call, not a message, not even a forwarded chain email pretending everything was fine. Rick sent one clipped email about family healing and moving past hurt, but it was more about painted Instagram stories about selfish siblings who abandon family, and people who pretend to be victims. But no one seemed to engage. The comment sections were quiet, and some of Brooke's followers even unfollowed her. The silence wasn't just absence, it was confirmation that Catherine had done the right thing. Without the constant tug of obligation, Catherine began to breathe. She flourished. Her days, once colored by compromise and emotional labor, were now filled with intention. She leaned into her new life. With Dan. They cooked dinner together without passive-aggressive phone calls interrupting. They talked about a future, maybe kids, maybe not, but definitely built on respect and shared joy. In that freedom, Catherine rediscovered her voice. She had always loved writing, but it had long been pushed aside by the noise of survival. Now, she let herself create. It started with a blog post titled "The Strong One," where she described growing up in the shadow of a sibling whose needs always eclipsed hers. She didn't name names. She didn't need to. The post went viral in niche writing forums. The comments poured in. "You just described my life. This made me cry. Thank you." Finally, someone said it. Emails followed. Private messages. Women who had spent years pretending they weren't hurt, thanking her for putting words to what they couldn't express. One woman wrote, "You gave me permission to stop apologizing for having boundaries." Catherine cried when she read that one. Dan encouraged her to apply for a creative writing grant, one that supported memoirs and untold family stories. She hesitated, then submitted an excerpt. Weeks later, the acceptance letter arrived. She'd been awarded full funding. It felt surreal, being paid not to relive the pain, but to process it, shape it, and share it on her own terms. Her first book began to take form. The working title, The Strong One, Surviving the Invisible Daughter Syndrome. Each chapter became a reclamation. The betrayal was no longer the center of the story. It was the beginning of something far more powerful. One afternoon, while searching for a childhood photo for the book's opening chapter, she opened an old storage box. Inside were crinkled birthday cards, faded drawings, and loose photos. One photo stopped her. It was from her 5th birthday party. In it, Brooke was blowing out the candles on Catherine's cake, while Diane looked on, smiling proudly. Catherine stood in the background, clapping, a party hat slightly askew. That image hit her harder than any fight ever had. She stared at the little girl who had already learned how to be invisible, who had clapped while someone else took her moment and called it love. Catherine didn't cry. She didn't rage. She framed the photo and placed it on her writing desk, not as a symbol of bitterness, but as a reminder of who she used to be, of how far she had come. Not just from her family's betrayal, but from the version of herself who once believed she had to earn their love by disappearing. That girl didn't vanish. She grew up, wrote her truth, and chose herself, every single day. Catherine never received a real apology. Not from her mother, who had smiled while robbing her of joy. Not from her father, who had chosen silence over protection. Not from her sister, who had always taken and never once considered the cost. And yet, the most surprising part of it all was that Catherine needed one anymore. Healing didn't arrive with a grand confrontation or a teary confession. It came in stillness. It came in early mornings with Dan, sipping coffee on their porch while the sun climbed over the trees. It came in belly laughs during board game nights with new friends who respected her without condition. It came in the quiet tap of keys as she typed essays and journal entries that spilled truth she had long kept hidden. Some nights, the grief still visited. Not for the people she had cut off, but for the child she had once been. the little girl who cleaned up everyone's messes, who earned gold stars but never affection, who watched birthdays slip by unnoticed because her sister had a tantrum. Catherine grieved that child. She grieved the safety she never had, the unconditional love she'd believed might come if she just tried harder. But that grief no longer ruled her. It passed through like a distant wave, acknowledged but not obeyed. Week by week, Catherine felt stronger, more whole. She no longer edited herself, no longer shrank to make others comfortable. She sent out holiday cards for the first time in years, not to Diane, Rick, or Brooke, but to the people who had shown up, the people who had stood beside her when everything cracked, her coworkers who'd left flowers on her desk after her first viral essay, the friend who had driven 6 hours just to attend her book launch, her therapist, who helped her untangle decades of silent pain, her in-laws, who'd welcomed her like she had always belonged. Every envelope sealed was a declaration. This is my family now, not bound by blood, but by choice, by love, not obligation, by mutual respect, not guilt. Sometimes, people from her past surfaced. A cousin who had once brushed her off, a former neighbor who remembered awkward family barbecues. They reached out with messages like, "I always wondered why they treated you like that," or, "I wish I had said something sooner." Catherine replied with grace. She thanked them. She wished them well. But deep down, she understood something crucial. She had never written, spoken out, or walked away for the sake of being seen by others. She had done it to finally see herself. And now, she did. In every boundary she honored, in every truth she told, in every moment of peace, she chose. She no longer needed to be chosen by them. She had already chosen herself. Some betrayals are not loud. They come in sighs, in eye rolls, in quiet dismissals. They show up in the way your voice is talked over, your milestones minimized, your joy seen as a threat. Catherine's story isn't just about money or stolen moments. It's about a lifetime of being told to be quiet, to be good, to make room for someone else's needs. But Catherine didn't just survive it. She walked away from the people who expected her silence. She turned a moment of erasure into a declaration of worth. She chose herself, and in doing so, she found a kind of peace that doesn't ask for permission. If you've ever been the one who held everything together while others tore you down, if you've ever swallowed your hurt just to keep the peace, Catherine's story is your reminder that strength doesn't mean staying. It means knowing when to leave. It means knowing your story deserves to be heard. Share this cheating story with someone who has always been the strong one. Leave a comment below if Catherine's journey felt familiar to you, because your voice matters here. And don't forget to like and subscribe to Veiled Fury, where women rewrite the narrative of betrayal and reclaim their power. We bring you stories that go deeper than drama, stories where pain becomes purpose and silence gives way to strength. This is Veiled Fury, where every woman rises.